Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about choice and free will. We are again going to be talking about classical school and its modern applications. And these applications are so modern, in fact, that we can apply them to even last week's inauguration. Bernie Sanders, in case you haven't heard, wore mittens to the inauguration. And while not a crime whatsoever, it could arguably be considered deviant. It was not the norm. He deviated from the norm. There was nobody else, to my knowledge, wearing mittens or attire like that. So it was a choice that he made. Now, he weighed the costs and benefits of this, right? He did not see enough cost. He did not see informal sanctions such as shame, loss of appeal, loss of self-confidence, self-esteem. He saw benefits of comfort, I assume, warmth, something like that. Those benefits outweighs the cost for him. And also, we can look at this through a routine activities theory standpoint. He was wearing these gloves because there was the opportunity to do so. It only happened because of a convergence of a few different things. Bernie was a motivated offender, if you will. Motivated because it was cold, I suppose. Motivated because he's an outsider. He is a socialist, and he likes to dress in drab monotones, I guess. But there was a lack of a capable guardian there. Capable guardian, in this case, no dress code. No dress code that I'm aware of, although I thought you had to wear a suit, but apparently not. And a vulnerable victim or vulnerable target for him was the gloves, I assume. He had these gloves, he didn't have to buy them. They were made for him perhaps, and he was able to take them and put them on. The convergence of all three of those, and time and space, him being there, him doing that, allowed this event to happen of him wearing mittens, right? And all joking aside, it's not a big deal whatsoever to wear mittens, but we will use these principles and apply them to some very serious crimes. So let me get reorganized here for a second. And here we are. That's a better situation. So today we are going to talk about, there we go, modern applications of classical school. As I said, we can apply them very recently. Actually, as recent, we'll get to this in a second, but we have this different perspective with some of these theories, right? We have been before this, and we're kind of going a little bit out of order here because what we need to keep in mind is we had the classical school, we had Beccaria, who was focusing on free will, choice, all of these elements. Lombroso came in, started to enact these other scientific testing and inquiry to determine other theories, and then from there we had a lot more in the 20th century. We had a hodgepodge of different socially geared theories. And then in the final quarter of the 20th century, 70-ish and on, we started to see a recurrence of those deterrence theories that focused on choice and free will and how we implemented the punishment having to do with that in the criminal justice system. There was, in the 70s, there was a crime increase. A lot of that had to do with just kind of the natural aging into crime of baby boomers at that time, but starting in 1980 through 1992, we saw this 3 consecutive terms of conservative Republican presidents in office. So a lot of our philosophies on punishment and deterrence kind of came about again. But prior to that, in that time frame between after Beccaria and until this resurgence again, we're focusing on what was it that was motivating people to commit crime. Why were some people committing crime? And instead, what we started to ask once we came back into classical school, the modern applications, is why does crime happen? And if you think about it, it seems like a small change, but it isn't. And it makes sense for us to now progress onto this question because in that time frame I just talked about, 1700s to the 1900s, where we were focusing on all these different variety of theories focusing on social elements, we continued to have crime. And actually at the time that deterrence theory really started to come back into application, we were seeing crime spike. So it logically makes sense if you look at the chronology of events that people would say, let's focus on something else because crime continues to exist. And an example, if you think of the attempted insurrection that happened on January 6th, 2021, obviously, there were a lot of motivated people to commit those crimes. A lot of people wanted to commit at least a number of crimes that did take place, in the very least, criminal trespass to government property. But there were a lot of people motivated to commit those crimes. And we saw it on social media, we saw it on other message boards, whatever. People were equally motivated, maybe as a result of that as well, in the idea that they felt they were defeated or whatever the case may be. People were equally as motivated to commit crimes, some potentially very serious crimes, on the inauguration day of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. But nothing happened. If you watched it last week, there wasn't anything. There were a couple things leading up to that in the week or so leading up where people were found with fake IDs and clearance passes or whatever, but nothing happened. So why did that not happen? If we want to focus on what motivates people to commit crimes, which we had been for a very long time, people were equally motivated on both those days. It's hard to measure, but people were generally equally motivated on both those days. Why on one day do we have an event, a criminal event, that's going to be in our history books of one of the most severe events, even if there weren't a number of casualties, but one of the most severe violations of laws and norms to take place, and the other day nothing happened? So we need to examine why that is. So we're focusing on similar ideas to with classical school and Beccaria, but this time as we come back into the 20th century, and to a certain extent the 21st century too. I mean, the routine activities theory, rational choice theory have not been disproved at this point, as we've talked about. Many theories aren't disproved, but we're still applying some of these. But once we saw the resurgence of it, we focused on the opportunity element, the situational crime element. So two main theories that I want to talk about a little bit today: rational choice theory and routine activities theory. Take a look at this. So as I referenced with my intro involving Bernie Sanders, we talk about a cost-benefit analysis when we talk about rational choice theory. Individuals in rational, keep in mind, we're not talking about what we see as rational, what most people see as rational. Because remember, deviance is people deviating from the norm. So if we think of the norm, we might have most people feeling that this is an irrational event, but to that one person or group of people, it follows a rational progression. So, and also rational meaning that they're of sound mind, they're not detached from reality or anything like that. Excuse me. Okay. So the rational thought process that the individual goes through manifests in a cost-benefit analysis. So if there are high costs in relation to the benefits, meaning there are more costs than there are benefits to commit a certain act or have a certain behavior, then that may in fact prevent crime, rather. So some costs that we can include can be formal and informal sanctions. So a formal sanction as a cost would be something we think of all the time, any act of the criminal justice system, really, being arrested, being incarcerated. We see those as And that's what drives deterrence theory that we talked about. And so those are costs that we believe are going to outweigh the benefits for individuals, thus preventing crime. And rational choice theory started to focus on this idea of informal sanctions as well, which I alluded to earlier. Shame, loss of self-esteem, losing friends, and then moral beliefs possibly. So some of these things are not associated at all with the criminal justice system, but they can actually be found to have more influence on individuals than the idea of being arrested or incarcerated, because people value their image a lot, and shame can influence that, and people value their close peers and their family, and those are all kind of informal sanctions that may result from them committing a crime that have nothing to do with the criminal justice system. So as we talk about these, I want you to consider something as we have our discussion later on. How much crime is the product of opportunity? We focus a lot of energy and a lot of theories on determining what motivates people to commit crimes. And we have a lot of different theories. And as I've said from the beginning, there are a lot of different theories that apply to a lot of different situations. So somebody might think then, are we really focusing on the right thing here? Are we using our time to focus on what's motivating people or why crime happens? Also, we know that people are motivated quite often to commit crime. And if there's something social, something individual, psychological, something biological that's motivating people to commit crime, that's going to be in place pretty much their entire life, or whenever it begins. There might be an end date, but somebody's social status, somebody's area in which they live, those are somewhat constant, especially biological elements are very constant. So if we are saying that that is increasing the likelihood that somebody will commit crime, that is staying with that person for most minutes of most days. And we are not seeing people commit crime for most minutes of most days. Crime, even if you have somebody who's a habitual offender, somebody who commits a lot of crime, they're still committing crime a very small percentage of the hours in the day. They're not spending their days committing crimes. Maybe they commit crime here and there, maybe even committing a crime daily, but even that is still not taking up all of their time. For the most part, people who commit crimes are living ordinary lives otherwise. So something that's motivating somebody to commit crime, why are they not always committing crime if that motivation is always with them, if that makes sense? So we need to look at what situations allow crime to occur. We'll talk about these with routine So there's kind of some debate about routine activity theory or routine activities theory. It's actually more common called routine activities theory, and that's what the creators call it. But some people have kind of taken on their own naming of it and refer to it as routine activity theory. But let's go with routine activities theory. So as I alluded to as well with my Bernie example, there are different elements that need to be present for a crime or act of deviance to occur. We need a motivated offender. We know that somebody needs to commit crime. However you define it, there's some actor who is the offender in the situation. Even if we're talking about an internet crime or something where there's no contact with victim and perpetrator, there's still some agent, some actor who is the motivated offender. Then we also need a suitable target or a vulnerable target. So there needs to be, even if it's not physical violence, interpersonal violence, there's no connection between the perpetrator and the victim, they still need to be suitable or vulnerable in some way. And I'll explain this in a moment. And then absence of guardians or lack of capable guardians. Capable is the important qualifier there. And then all of that must come together, must converge in space and time, all be present at the same time. You can't have a motivated offender and then at different points the target is more suitable, and at different points the capable guardian is more present. All needs to happen at the same time. Situational, we're looking at crime as a behavior, but more than a behavior is something that happens as a result of other elements being converging together. Try that again. All right. Routine activities theory. Sometimes it's said that there's the four elements. The fourth element is just time and space converging. So we're going to focus on these three main elements. Again, motivated offender, person who has a propensity or inclination to offend. And then the suitable or vulnerable target is the object, person, property that the offender would like to take control of. Lack of capable guardians. So the guardians can be friends, family, security personnel, dogs, law enforcement, obviously, any other presence of the criminal justice system. And also a person can be a guardian of his or her own property, and person or property. So guardian, they can be a guardian of themselves as well. I'll get into some examples of that. Motivated offender. And for a lot of people, and if you want to get very technical about the validity of this theory in explaining crime and deviance, it does kind of make a big assumption. What I mean by that is it kind of, if you're trying to prove something, you have this assumption that you're not really proving at all. You're just kind of saying, this is already present, this is already there, and from there, I'll go on and incorporate all these other elements to prove why crime exists. So this assumption they're making is kind of that an offender is already motivated, that we already have somebody who has the desire to be deviant or commit crime. And if you think about it, that's what basically all the other theories are trying to explain, is why that person is motivated to offend and to commit crime. So some people may argue that this isn't as strong and valid of a criminological theory because it doesn't try to explain that. It's a valid concern, I guess, but the end goal is for us to explain crime, right? And explain why crime occurs. And so if we're saying that people are motivated for a number of different reasons, whatever, you can apply these other theories as well to just get an offender motivated to commit crime. But if we're saying that for whatever reason they're motivated and that's what it is, but from there, this is why crime takes place, then that's a good thing. So there may be some discussion about the validity of that, but that's okay. Suitable or vulnerable target. So the crime, like I said, can't take place without a victim, and it needs to be somewhat suitable, somebody who can be victimized. Again, can be interpersonal violence, can be anything else. And then we start to get into some interesting conversations if we think about victimless crimes and some other public order crimes, because people might argue that there's not a victim, or there's a target at least then, and we'll talk about the semantics there. But it can mean that it's attractive in the sense of the object is very rewarding to the person. A lot of money is more of a suitable target than a little bit of money. If we're talking about somebody committing theft, unless we're talking about actual dollar bills where you have a lot more in this situation, $10,000 is going to be much more suitable to that person than $5 if they're wanting to commit a theft. So it's intriguing, enticing to them. Serves as more of a benefit, even though we talk about benefits and costs with rational choice theory. But sometimes it's a discussion of the opportunity to reach that target. And so if we have a vacant house and the house is the target and what's inside the house is the target, the vacant house also brings into account the capable guardian. But for instance, an unlocked car. An unlocked car is much more vulnerable of a target than a locked car, and much more so than a locked car with a security system, right? And again, those are actually good examples of capable guardians. since we have a lot of crime that is especially sexual crime, sexual violence, as male perpetrating females, female walking alone could be a very vulnerable target compared to somebody walking in a group. Bars can serve as areas where there's a lot of vulnerable targets because there's a lot of people interacting with each other, alcohol present, and carrying cash. That makes somebody a much more, although you might not know this by looking at somebody, but if you see it, it makes somebody a much more vulnerable target than somebody who only has credit cards or only uses Venmo or anything digital, because, or Bitcoin, right? If you have Bitcoin. But somebody's not going to be able to access that the same way once they steal it from somebody as having cash. So given the opportunity, if somebody's motivated in the same way for money because of strain theory or something like that, seeing cash versus seeing somebody on a Venmo account is going to be much different. One is going to be much more suitable and vulnerable a target in the perception and the rationale of that offender. And another example, having a vehicle full of purchased goods. If you can actually see things and you see that there's an abundance of something, that's going to be much more suitable target than, for instance, a car where you can't see that there's anything in the back. And then a lack of a capable guardian is the other element. Capable is a key word here, but not only do we need to have a target or a victim that's vulnerable, but we also need to not have anything there that's guarding that victim or that target. And so that capable guardian can be very literal, can be law enforcement, security guard, somebody else who might be working to protect something. But it may also be something like a security system, owning a dog, a fence. Those are all kind of capable guardians because they might prevent you from entering somewhere. They might prevent you from viewing something. Having increased lighting on your house, lighting above the area you park, lighting in other areas you're going to be walking. Those are all things that can present this guardian that's going to be, even if you feel like a light and a law enforcement officer are not on the same level in terms of their capability of guarding you, which I would argue that you're correct, but certain very small, very minuscule elements of guardianship go a very long way in preventing crime from happening. Uplighting on houses, lighting on houses. People have security systems, right? And there's kind of this joke that the most efficient security system is actually just the sign you put in your front yard. I don't know if that's a joke, but I say it sometimes to people, but because people see that and they get the idea that there is a security system there. So whether or not the security system is actually there, whether or not it works, whether or not it's enabled, whether, how complex it is, how complete it is it just a couple cameras or are there actual locking mechanisms, the idea of the security system can be enough of a capable guardian when in fact it's just a sign. There isn't anything else included with that. But so home alarms, video monitoring as well. And there's a lot of examples of just placing, and you can make some good arguments that cameras on phones have increased the amount of capable guardians that are just out in the public at any given time, right? But video cameras, there have been a number of examples of different locations video cameras have been placed that serve as capable guardians. And remember, there are many people who see a guardian in whatever form and they decide to commit a crime anyway, and that's, I guess, because they don't perceive that person as capable or whatever the case may be. So keep that in mind. Nothing is foolproof, but there's a number of different examples of cameras being placed in ATMs to start with. That happened, a number of decades ago. They started doing that, and I think people in general, there's a consensus that people understand there are cameras there, so there's not as many muggings as there used to be when ATMs first started. Red light cameras, as controversial as they are in terms of whether or not you should be able to get a ordinance violation from an inanimate object and not law enforcement, but the presence of those, the signs, other signs on the highway that say you're being monitored by radar or helicopters at times and stuff like that, those can serve as capable guardians because people, if they know that they're being observed and they're about to do something that would be considered criminal, they're less likely to do it. Blue light buttons, like on campus and stuff like that, the emergency buttons, those are capable guardians. Whether or not one is utilized, whatever the case is, people will see those, and it's possible that just the buttons being there and the blue light being there, and blue light cameras in the city and stuff, just the presence will prevent people from, even if they're motivated as an offender, will prevent them from attacking a target or a victim. And people can also serve as, people themselves can serve as capable guardians without necessarily doing anything to guard, but just kind of being there as well. That can motivate somebody to not partake in something if their friends are there, family, loved one, spouse, kids, right? If your kids are there, their presence there might just be enough to prevent you from doing something. Even if you're motivated to, and there's a target, if a vulnerable target, if there's a $50 bill on the ground, even if I were motivated to take it and it was right there and no one else was around there, if my kid was watching me, I might not do it. He's young, so he doesn't exactly know what I'd be doing, but still, that may prevent somebody enough, even if just the presence and the idea of somebody. The same way that the public can serve and crowds can serve as capable guardians as well. Just because you might not know anybody and you don't know if anyone's necessarily watching you, but just the idea of being in the public could be enough of a capable guardian. Let's take a look at an example or two. Start with Lewis. Lewis lives in a community that does not have abundant resources. He is of lower socioeconomic status, and at times his neighborhood has been referred to as a food desert. So if you don't know, a food desert is basically a different area that does not have easily accessible, nutritious food, fresh produce, other food really more than food that you'd find at stores that are not grocery stores. So convenience stores, gas stations, dollar stores, things that do have food, but nothing that is nutritious, healthy, good for the body, good for the mind. One day after school, Lewis walks past a food truck. So a food truck, a truck that's out there preparing food on wheels and whatnot. He has never seen this food truck before, but they appear to be selling many handheld pre-wrapped sandwiches. There are people working the food truck, but all are currently preoccupied and not appropriately monitoring their products. As Lewis gets next to the truck, he grabs a sandwich and Gatorade and keeps walking home. Nobody notices, and Lewis is never caught. Think about that for a second. I'll point out some elements. There are elements of, we're focusing here on routine activities theory, but rational choice theory as well to a certain degree. All three elements are present in this one scenario. I'll point them out and point out a couple other things that we can kind of imply just from this small scenario to help further reinforce routine activities theory. So as I said, Lewis is motivated. His motivation in this situation, we see that he's of lower socioeconomic status. His neighborhood has been referred to as a food desert, so he could possibly fall into this Social disorganization theory, we'll talk about in a little while. Strain theory as well. He doesn't have the resources that other people might have based on social structure. Lower socioeconomic status, that is referring directly to strain. Being a food desert means you don't have the same resources as other people have. Everybody has a need for nourishment, for food, and those are resources that Lewis doesn't necessarily have access to. So he walks past this food truck, and now this resource is introduced, one he's never seen before. So something that points out, he's never seen this food truck before. So that's kind of the bigger picture. That sentence refers to this bigger picture concept of crime being situational and based on opportunity, right? This isn't a crime and a theft that Lewis has been planning out. He hasn't been staking this out and then planning what he's going to do. So it is based on opportunity and based on this situation and the convergence of all three of these elements in time and space. So that just reinforces us looking at things from a situational lens. But they appear to be selling handheld pre-wrapped sandwiches. So the sandwich that we know he takes later, the fact that they're handheld pre-wrapped sandwiches goes a long way. That makes those sandwiches in this situation a very vulnerable, attractive target. Handheld obviously makes them easier to transport. So when we talk about theft in any way, a key is being able to move that product. And so if we're talking about individual low-level theft or larceny, if somebody can get their hands on it, better yet, if somebody can just hold that in their hand or hands, it makes it much easier to transport, much more likely to be taken, much more suitable target. Pre-wrapped also makes it much more suitable. It could be something that he puts in his coat right away if it's pre-wrapped differently than a gyro or something that's not wrapped at all. He's less likely to put, and these are also probably cold, they could be warm, I guess, but there are other things like a slice of pizza is going to be a much different target than, even though it's handheld as well, than a pre-wrapped cold sandwich, right? Those are two very different targets. And the vulnerability or the attractiveness of one target greatly increases its chance of being stolen, being the target of a theft. So I think that makes sense to people probably, but it's going to be much different to steal a slice of pizza than a slice of hot pizza than a pre-wrapped cold sandwich. So there are people working there, obviously, but they're preoccupied and they're not monitoring the product. So there are guardians there, right? These are people who are, supposed to be guarding these targets and victims of the food that they're making. But as it explains, they're preoccupied. They're not appropriately monitoring their products. So they wouldn't constitute a capable guardian. So the capable qualifier in that element is extremely important, because just the presence of guardians is not enough necessarily to prevent crime from occurring. They need to be a capable guardian. So he's able to get next to the truck, grabs a sandwich and a Gatorade. Again, the Gatorade is something that he would be able to grab as opposed to, very quickly, as opposed to, a fountain drink. A fountain drink he has to request for them to make, give me a Diet Coke from the fountain, so they're going to have to make that, so you have to engage them, and it's harder to carry. A Gatorade, just like the pre-wrapped sandwiches, could be thrown in a pocket. So he keeps walking home, nobody notices, and Lewis is never caught. So that's a good example of routine activities theory. There are also some elements of rational choice. The fact that nobody was watching him, for him maybe meant there's lower cost because he didn't think he would get caught at all. So that can factor in as well. Let's do another example. And this one's a little bit different from the previous example. So I think this is good to show the versatility that this theory has. And it makes sense if you, and again, we're kind of making an assumption and kind of disregarding a key focus that many theories have, which is what motivates people to offend. But this theory, it takes into consideration any other theory that might apply. People are motivated for different reasons, as we've said, as they're motivated to do different things for different reasons as well. So that's not exactly important. What's important is, when motivated, what other things need to be present or not be present for crime to take place, for that situation to occur where crime happens. So let's talk about Tammy. Tammy has been very depressed. She has had a relationship end recently, as well as not get hired for a job she really wanted. Tammy feels like using benzodiazepines as a way to help her cope with these issues. So benzodiazepines, Klonopin, Xanax, things like that. I believe Xanax is a benzo. She does not have a valid prescription, nor does she currently have any benzos. So she will need to get them from somebody else. Her good friend Kate often sells pills to college students at parties. So she asks her. Kate says, "Sure, and don't even worry about paying. Your family." Tammy meets Kate at her apartment, where she gives her a bottle of Klonopin. There you go, there's an example. Saying there is more where that came from. So like I said, much different example than our friend Lewis. But still as applicable, I would say. So I've highlighted a couple things. I didn't give you folks time to think about it, but I assume you did. So a couple different elements for us to point out. All three major elements of routine activities theory are present within the short scenario to varying degrees. So we see right off the bat, and we don't, it's easiest kind of to go in order, I suppose, motivated offender and on. So Tammy, it says, is very depressed. She had a relationship end recently, and she did not get hired for a job she really wanted. As we get into some other theories, because I know we haven't talked about too many yet, but you can probably just guess based on this that she might be motivated to commit the crime. And the crime in this case would be having unlawful possession of controlled substance, or if you want to say abuse of the benzos as a form of deviance. Abuse of the benzos isn't necessarily criminal, just the possession of it without a prescription is criminal. It's class 4 felony in Illinois. So you can look at it as a form of deviance or as an actual criminal violation. But she's depressed, and she's had that relationship end recently, and she's not getting hired for a job. So two things that are mentioned are directly associated with general strain theory, which we'll talk about later, but something positive ending and failing to achieve a certain goal. The idea here is that when those things happen, if people can't cope with them, as I mentioned here, if people can't cope with those changes in their life, then they will commit crimes. So if you know general strain theory, you're going to see in the first three sentences that the ideas of that theory explain what's motivating Tammy to be an offender in this case, okay? So she doesn't have a valid prescription, nor does she currently have any, so she will need to get them from somebody else. If she had a valid prescription, if she had some, then this crime itself wouldn't actually take place. She'd still be in possession, I guess. So I'm not sure. I mean, I wrote this, but I'm not sure if the valid prescription means she's never had a valid prescription or it ran out. So not a lot different there, I guess. But her good friend Kate sells pills to college students at parties. So Kate here, so if we think about the actual unlawfully obtaining and possessing the controlled substance, if we think of that as the deviant act, the target or the victim or the target in the situation is actually the benzos themselves. They're actually the drugs themselves that she's going to possess. So Kate plays a role in this too. She could play a bigger role, and I'll get to that, but she plays a role in this with the fact that she's a good friend. And then later on she says, don't worry about paying your family. Those elements of this scenario, Kate, the presence of Kate being a good friend, Kate not saying, definitely I'll get those to you right now, you don't have to pay for them, that makes these benzodiazepines a much more attractive, desirable target for Tammy. If it was somebody she knew casually, if it was a classmate, if it was a suite mate, a neighbor, or something like that, and she said, yes, this is what I'm charging for drugs these days, then that would be not as vulnerable and not as attractive of a target. So if we think about this situation that's happening here, if that were the case, this crime, this possession of controlled substance might not happen. So, and what Kate also isn't providing something. She's not being a capable guardian. She is a good friend, as we point out, and many might say that a really good friend in this situation, even though she's, selling drugs, I guess, to college students, who knows, whatever. For whatever reason, Kate's doing that. It doesn't matter in this situation. She has a good friend who's coming to her. She might say, Tammy, I know you've been through a lot. Let's go get a coffee or something like that, right? So she could present as a capable guardian, not by necessarily physically preventing something, and as we would see in many other situations, but by presenting her love and her emotion, I guess, as a way to guard her friend Tammy from doing this thing, committing this crime. And then, on a more practical standpoint, they meet at Kate's in the apartment, which is going to lack any capable guardians unless there's a roommate or something like that. But if she said, yes, let's do it at Target or something, that wouldn't be quite the same situation. You'd be out in the public. There are cameras which might pick up something that looks like a drug deal. So the fact that they're in the private space also removes some other capable guardians from even being there. And she says there's more where that came from, which isn't exactly relevant to that. But all of those things working together are allowing this crime or act of deviance to take place. And if we start picking some of them apart and start removing some of them a little bit, then that can change things. If Tammy's more equipped to cope with this, if she's going to therapy, if she's doing anything else, then she might not ever become the motivated offender, right? So we can alter that. If she doesn't go to Kate, she has to go to somebody else, somebody who is kind of sketchy, somebody who's potentially putting her in danger, depending on where they want to meet. They're charging a lot of money. That's going to affect the vulnerability of the target or the attractiveness of the target. And then Kate could be a capable guardian. She could say, let's not do this, let's go talk instead. I know your relationship was good, let's talk about that. And she could do it in public, which would present some other capable guardians as well. And we're not going to go through these, but just a couple things to consider. Even though this is a different type of criminological theory because it's situational and we don't focus on as much the motivation for the offender, we just kind of assume he or she is motivated, it can be applied in a lot of different contexts. And that's really a good sign of a theory. A good theory is if we can apply it to a lot of different crimes. I know I said there isn't one theory that we can apply to all crimes, and I do agree with that, and I stand by that, but if there's one, and one way of thinking rather, that we can apply to a lot of different types of criminal activity or deviance, then that's very successful in trying to explain why crime exists so much. And I'm not going to go into all of these just for time and whatnot, but think of these. all of these crimes and events can be explained by routine activities theory mainly, also rational choice theory. And once we do explain them, if we the practical and policy implications of focusing on routine activities theory is once we identify these different elements, especially if we're talking about a capable guardian, it's a little, the motivated offender, we can definitely focus on that through other avenues, but in terms of the criminal justice system, when we break these down and identify the different parts, we can do a lot to affect and change the capability of guardians and the presence of guardians. But things like the JFK assassination, I know that's possibly one of the topics for the final paper, so I'm not going to go into it a lot, but a lot of people, the other element of routine activities theory is how kind of minimalist it is, and breaks it down a lot breaks it down more than a lot of people are comfortable with. For instance, JFK assassination, there's a lot of conspiracies out there. People love to make movies, and The Irishman just came out, which kind of had a reference to that last year, just 2 years ago came out. So, but people like to make this event bigger than it was, just because it's a presidential assassination. But if you look at the details, it may have just been a situation where a lot of things came together that made it possible for this assassination to take place. So it does kind of minimalize, makes it a little deductive by breaking it down to all these small things that criminologists who have spent decades of life trying to figure this out might not want to focus on just these little aspects of, well, if you would have had not a convertible but an armored car, then this assassination wouldn't have taken place. So breaking it down like that may be difficult for some people just because it kind of minimizes some of the work they're trying to do. But I guess that's one way to look at it. But all these other crimes, you can look at elements. We talked about like a home invasion before, and DUI if you have something like you have to blow into your car before you start it for your blood alcohol. That's an amazing capable guardian. Are people going to continue to drink and drive? They're going to drive somewhere and then continue to drink. That's not going to affect their motivation. That's not going to affect the attractiveness of the target or the vulnerability of the target, in this case alcohol. We can still buy alcohol wherever you want basically, but if you affect that third element, the capable guardian, then you prevent DUIs, right? And there's a number of other things that have been in place to do that as well. And those, I just summed it up a little bit here, but I'm not going to go over that right now. But the focus with these theories, and I know I spent most of our time talking about routine activities theory, but it focuses on the situation and crime itself, not the likelihood of somebody to commit crime, not the criminality aspect. Why are certain people going to commit crime? What is going to influence people to commit crime? But we know that's going to happen regardless, unfortunately, and especially when you talk about deviance. People are going to deviate regardless of time and who they are and everything like that. People will continue to deviate. So the more important aspect is to focus on why crime then does happen. Because again, it doesn't always happen. There are a lot of people that are very motivated to commit crime that, if you look at strain theory, they live their entire lives in a low socioeconomic status where they don't have resources and they don't have legitimate means, but they still have all the same goals, but they might never commit a crime. They might be motivated to their entire lives, but if the situation never presents itself, then it might not occur. Okay. So I think that's where we're going to end. I went pretty long today. It was mainly because of my very funny intro this week. So we're going to call that a day. Go over some of these discussion questions, the ones we talked about earlier on. We'll have a good discussion about this coming up this week. So everybody take care. I'll see you next week. Where did I put those mittens? itchy.
They're warm though.
I'll give them that. They are warm. Itchy.